Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This week, I have the honor and privilege of having the philosopher Gregg Caruso on the podcast. Gregg is a professor of philosophy at SUNY and honorary professor of philosophy at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He's taught at the University of Aberdeen, School of Law in Scotland. He has his BA in philosophy, his MPhil, and his PhD in philosophy from City University of New York City. And he is the author of two new books, Just Desserts, Debating Free Will with Dan Dennett, and his other book, Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice, along with many other books. He is mostly concerned in the areas of free will, moral responsibility, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and overall social and political philosophy. So Gregg is kind of a powerhouse in terms of free will and moral responsibility in the philosophy world. So I was really fortunate to get him on here, and we had an awesome conversation. In this conversation, we talked about both of his new books coming out, or Just Desserts is out already, but and the other book coming out in a month or so. So we started the conversation with kind of his reason for writing these two new books and the rationale and how they're a little bit different. He talked to kind of background and story of connecting with Dan Dennett and their exchange and how they decided to publish it, which is pretty cool. And so then we launch into a definition of free will and how he understands free will and how he uses it. We talk about a definition of dessert, which, is for laymen, that's kind of a strange term. So we talk about that. We talk about how free will works with retributive justice and or punishment. We have a section where we talk about the aspect of luck and kind of the three different components. We also talk about the role of moral and social emotions with free will. We also talk about the various ways of doing preventative and rehabilitative work as opposed to just punitive kinds of justice. And we also talk about some of the social determinants of preventing criminal behavior and also the public health components that are implicated in a need for change in different aspects, and along with many other topics. The time went so quick with Gregg, and I was really, really happy to get a good amount of time to talk about these issues. Of course, he's in and out of this stuff all the time, so he's right there with it. So of course, we could talk for hours about free will and moral responsibility, but I was really pleased with this conversation because I think that it gives a really, really good idea of these topics, and it goes to it in some depth. We use some examples, and so hopefully listeners can kind of walk away with a better understanding of some of the different ideas surrounding free will and moral responsibility and just overall kind of moral philosophy. So, without further ado, I bring you Gregg Caruso. I am here with Gregg Caruso. Gregg, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a big honor. It's a big privilege. I know you are prolific in all of your writing. I feel like you have something always coming out every month or so. It's pretty incredible. How do you have so much energy to put all this stuff out?
It's difficult, especially with a heavy teaching load. But
I can imagine.
Yeah, I've been really productive lately. Two new books coming out. One with Dan Dennett, called Just Desserts, Debating Free Will, and then another one coming out in about a month called Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, Criminal Justice. Yeah.
I'm assuming that there was a lot of crossover. Obviously, it's a very similar topic. It's not. So I'm assuming that was maybe somewhat easy in how you were writing things. It's kind of like, okay, this is for this and this is for this kind of thing. Or
yeah, I mean, the Rejecting Retributivism book is something I've been working on for a while. So it is a sort of development of my free will skepticism, but it also is trying to develop an alternative approach to criminal punishment and addressing basically criminal behavior. And yeah, so a lot of those topics get covered in the sort of Dennett book, but I see the Dennett book as kind of a more of an exchange, having to do with sort of the notion of dessert
Hmm.
and whether, his conception of dessert or my conception of dessert is sort of the
Hmm.
right one.
Hmm.
And we get into the weeds in terms of our differences in regards to free will.
Yeah.
Some of the arguments is sort of present in both books, but I feel like the Rejecting Retributivism book is sort of the most mature statement of my current view.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and I think the Dennett book is more accessible to a popular audience, and so it'll and because of Dennett's involvement, it'll probably reach a much larger audience.
Sure.
So I see the latter book is sort of more for academics, um,
How did
whereas the
the
Dennett book I think is acceptable, accessible for everybody.
Yeah, I was going to say you have two books coming out a month apart, which is where I guess the Justice Earth has been out in Europe for a little bit. But how did I guess the first book come about? Was that just you called up Dan, you're like, hey, let's do this, or was it someone put you together? How did that kind of happen?
Yeah, so I helped organize a conference at the American University of Beirut. I have a friend from graduate school who is the chair over there, and it was a conference on moral psychology. I think it was the first conference on moral psychology in the Middle East,
Wow.
at least according to our knowledge. And Dan was one of the speakers, and we had Paul Bloom and a bunch of other really big name people.
Hmm.
And one night after sort of the sessions ended, we were on this rooftop bar
Hmm.
in Beirut, and we started arguing about free will, and then it
That's
kind of
cool.
carried over to breakfast, and it was a sort of fun week. And when we got back, we just sort of continued to volley emails back and forth. And at one point, I think I suggested, "Why don't we write this up?"
Hmm.
And the first exchange was published on Aeon magazine
Hmm.
as a kind of initial exchange. We thought that was sort of the end of it, and then a bunch of people really were interested in whether or not we wanted to expand that exchange, turn it into a book. And so we both really respect each other and our differences. So we decided it'd be a worthwhile project. So we just did it,
That's
and it
cool.
really evolved quickly.
Mm.
It was sort of almost real time. I mean, we were sending back and forth exchanges almost on a daily basis.
That's cool.
So in a way, it really is a snapshot
Mm.
of our thinking, and we didn't really allow for too much editing,
Mm, it's
which
cool.
was both good and bad. I mean, on the one hand, when you write a book, you usually go back and hone your arguments and correct little mistakes, but we thought it was sort of unfair to each other if we changed our words earlier in the exchange
Hmm.
when someone later responded to it. So we pretty much left things as they unfolded. Maybe we went back, cleaned up a few things, made a few clarifications, but nothing of substance. So um, in that way, it was a kind of unique project. I've never done something where I sort of
Yeah.
locked into what I said on the first draft.
That's a really cool experience. Yeah, and just
Yeah,
kind of the origins of it, and then how it all came out is really really cool.
yeah,
So let's start with that book first, and then we'll hit the next one that's coming out.
yeah.
Um, so maybe we can do. I know this is a hard thing to do, but maybe you can give me a sort of definition of how you define free will first, which I know is hard. And there's like the libertarian definition. There's all these different definitions, but what's kind of a standard definition that you use, or that you, I guess, both are operating from in your exchanges?
Yeah, so I think the one thing me and Dan share is that we define free will in terms of moral responsibility.
Hmm.
So we define free will as the control and action required for moral responsibility. And that way of defining free will, I think, is beneficial for a number of reasons. I mean, one, it's a sort of neutral definition that all parties can agree to. It
Hmm.
doesn't sort of bake into the cake a compatibilist conception or a libertarian conception of free will. Um, it also keeps the issue practically grounded in things we care about. Things like our interpersonal interactions, moral practices like blame and praise, and resentment and indignation, as well as punishment, retribution, legal practices.
Hmm.
Um, where me and Dan disagree, and so this is a sort of point that I've been trying to drive home in my work for a long time, is I define free will in terms of the control and action for a very specific, but what I consider pervasive notion of moral responsibility, which I call basic desert moral responsibility. So for an agent to be free in this sense is for them to be truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward in a purely backward-looking sense, a non-consequentialist or non-contractualist sense. So if you were to do something wrong, you deserve to be blamed for that. You have a kind of blameworthiness that's basic in the sense that it's just grounded in your wrongdoing. It's not grounded in any future benefits of blaming you or some contractualist considerations about blame. Dennett acknowledges that we don't have that kind of basic desert, more responsibility. So in a certain sense, I feel like I kind of win the game right off the bat, in the sense that that's the kind of more responsibility free will skeptics are concerned about. I'm a skeptic, by the way. So I deny agents have this kind of free will and this kind of basic desert, more responsibility. And Dennett agrees with that. He doesn't think this notion could fit into our naturalistic worldview. But then so he defends what he considers a non-basic notion of desert, where for Dan, or for Dennett, basically our desert practices or the whole desert system is justified on forward-looking grounds. It's justified on a kind of consequentialist set of considerations. We'd be better off adopting these practices of desert. Whereas I don't think that that's really what's of issue. I've argued for a while that what is of key significance, philosophically and practically speaking, is this notion of basic desert. That's what's really at issue in the debate. So there's a bit of a sort of talking past each other at a few points.
I was going to say, it's like operate on different levels. And then there's a
sense in which I also say, okay, look, let's talk about your conception of desert and see if it holds up. Since you already acknowledge we don't have free will in the basic desert sense. Now, Dan would disagree with maybe completely with my way of framing this, because he doesn't think the basic notion is at all the important notion. When he talks about the free will worth wanting, what he really cares about, I think, is maintaining certain practices of punishment and blame. He thinks society couldn't function without these. And I sort of disagree on those terms as well. But I think one of the significant differences is that we have sort of two different definitions of what we think of as important. But the one thing that we do share is that we both define free will in terms of moral responsibility, which I think is important. Because, you see a lot of scientific literature on free will where they're just assuming from the get-go that free will means libertarian free will. And it's sort of easy for them to dismiss it or disprove it then. Or you have compatibilists who start right from the beginning sort of defining free will in terms of reasons responsiveness or uncoerced behavior or some sort of behavior that is guided by our inner values or in accordance with our inner principles. I don't deny we have that kind of free will. So what I say is that the compatibilist view, we have these kind of distinctions between agents that are responsive to reasons and could be guided by reasons and agents that suffer from mental illnesses. But what I argue is that kind of control is still not enough to ground what we truly care about, which is our agents deserving of praise and blame in this basic sense, in this purely backward-looking sense.
So both of you guys are having this idea that free will is almost inextricably linked with moral responsibility.
Yeah.
In fact, could you say that one can't exist without the other, right? In this way of defining it. So to understand or to have, I guess you could say, moral responsibility, you need some idea of free will, or is that?
What I'm considering, well, first, let me just say a couple of things to clarify, too. I think there are other conceptions of responsibility that don't rely on free will and that are perfectly acceptable for skeptics and deniers of free will to embrace. Okay. I'm only denying the existence of a particular type of moral responsibility I call basic desert. But yes, I think a necessary condition for agents to be responsible in that sense is that they have this kind of control and action where you associate with free will. Other conditions may also be required, so it's not sufficient. Some philosophers think epistemic conditions also need to be satisfied. You have to have an understanding of the wrongfulness of your actions to be blameworthy. But setting those aside, the control and action is the kind, and that's what I'm considering free will, is a sort of condition, a necessary condition for this kind of moral responsibility.
Yeah. So just for listeners, explain the desserts definition. Is always a strange word at first. I remember when I first came across it, I was like, a dessert? What is this? This cake and ice cream? What are they talking about?
Yeah.
I had to get used to it. And then kind of what you were saying, the basic dessert, and then the other forms of it, just for listeners to define.
Yeah. So, the title of the book is Just Desserts, and I've gotten people email me say, "Oh, there's a typo, there's a missing S," or no. Just Desserts means someone, got to give someone their just desserts, meaning something about the deservedness of blame and praising practices. Not talking about what you have after dinner, not talking about desserts. It's a kind of notion of dessert. And the question I care about is whether agents have a very particular kind. So let me give you an example that I use in the book. And it comes from Immanuel Kant, who was a retributivist, which we could talk about later.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, imagine an island society where the members of the society have agreed to disband, dissolve their social contract, and scatter around the planet. But there's one remaining prisoner in jail, and it's a murderer. Kant says, in his view, that this individual deserves to be executed. Not only are you justified actually in executing this prisoner before you leave the island, he thinks you're obligated. But that's a slightly sort of different question. But he says that, this person deserves to be executed simply because of the wrongfulness of their act. They committed a murder. And for Kant, he thinks the only suitable punishment for murder was death. So not everyone agrees with that.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is whether this individual deserves to be punished before the last person exits the island. Now, the reason this is a good example to see sort of what your intuitions on desert is that you're supposed to imagine a case where, look, there'd be no forward-looking benefit to punishing this individual. So you're not punishing this individual to deter others. There's no one left to deter. You're not punishing this individual to help in their moral formation or their moral education, because in this case, you're executing them. You're not punishing this individual to make others safer, because there's no one left to protect in terms of safety. The only justification you would have in this particular sort of hypothetical situation is simply backwards-looking desert. And this is a kind of notion that they deserve this type of punishment simply because of the nature of their wrongdoing. And that the punishment is, somehow intrinsically good. It's good, not justified in terms of forward-looking, considerations like safety or reconciliation or moral formation. It's simply deserved in this non-consequential sense. And by that, I mean non-forward-looking sense. And I want to ask, do agents have that kind of free will that would ground that kind of desert? And I say no. Dan sort of says, well, that's just the wrong kind of model. That's the wrong sort of setup. But he wants to preserve a kind of watered down notion of desert. And that's sort of where our debate begins.
I think the initial push for people would be, well, that's just.
Yeah.
That's justice, right? You do something wrong, you have to have justice for that. Whether it's forward thinking, whether it's risk adverse, whether it's you do the crime, you do the time, right? It's that whole notion of you have to have. It's all. To me, it kind of comes from some type of, Protestant or some type of religious undertone of like you have to pay penance. You have to have something. You learn your lesson, right? Now, in this case, death would be like the ultimate lesson learned, I guess, for this person. But you have to do something. You couldn't just get away with something, because if you get away with it, then maybe in this case, whatever, but then what kind of society are you creating where people would say, well, if you don't get, dessert, just, basic dessert, then what's going to happen is other people are going to do other things and they're going to say,
okay,
well, I don't need to.
You're already smuggling in forward-looking considerations. You're already smuggling in like, well, if we don't do this, there'll be these and that's sort of where Dennett's at, right? Dennett's at the idea that we need to maintain this notion of dessert because otherwise, like, society will crumble. Now, I disagree with his.
That's not my position. I'm saying that's the argument that what people will say. Which
I mean, and Dennett would also agree with something else you said, which is that this notion of basic desert is sort of a hangover from religious, conceptions of free will and sort of standing before God kind of notion of desert. Um, and I just think that, yes, it probably has come to us through this kind of Christian framework or Judeo-Christian kind of framework. But I also think a lot of the discussion of free will is kind of comes to us through that sort of tradition of what, what matters, whether we can justly praise or blame or punish or reward people in this kind of way.
Yep.
I think, one way for me to water it down, so we're not talking about death, is imagine sort of two deterministic universes. And by determinism, for listeners that don't know, sort of the thesis that every event or action, including human action, is determined by antecedent conditions in combination with the laws of nature. So if determinism is true, every state of the universe is causally determined, such that there's only one fixed future at any given moment. Given the laws of nature, given antecedent conditions, the future is fixed, is determined by the combination of factors. So imagine you have universe A, and from the Big Bang on, everything is deterministic in that, action A causes action B deterministically, such and so on. And in universe A, everything has occurred since the Big Bang on, so that Maya, on her 21st birthday, robs a liquor store. And she robs a liquor store because she's been causally determined since the beginning of time to have the mental states that she has at that particular moment, to have the desires that she has, to reason in the fashion that she does. And all of these deterministic factors have caused her to be in this particular psychological state where she makes this particular form, deliberation and engages in this action. But she's completely determined, right? She couldn't have done otherwise. The ultimate source of her action drains back to these antecedent causes, all the way back to the Big Bang. And now imagine another deterministic universe B. And in this universe, everything has been set up since the Big Bang on, so that Marina, on her 21st birthday, gives $1,000 to charity. But again, her decision is determined by all these antecedent conditions, by the state of her mind, her psychological predispositions, her character, all of which were determined by antecedent conditions, her upbringing, her past, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to know is if some neutral judge, now it doesn't have to be God, but some person, let's say in the afterlife, you have have you ever, any of your listeners ever saw, The Good Place, right? Imagine a case where like your actions have been tallied throughout your lifetime, and it's going to kind of determine whether you get a certain reward or a certain punishment. Now, it doesn't have to be eternal damnation or eternal reward. I just want to know any difference in treatment between Maya and Marina. Is it justified if Maya is in a deterministic universe that determines her to rob the liquor store, and Marina was in a deterministic universe that determined that she gave the charity? One is a sort of, superficially a praiseworthy act, and one of them seems to be a blameworthy act. Now, the compatibilist would say, I would think, is that Maya is blameworthy nonetheless, and Marina is praiseworthy. And I want to push the intuition that neither is blameworthy or praiseworthy, in that their actions are the result of factors beyond their control. Maya couldn't have, in no way is the ultimate source of her actions, she's not the appropriate source of her actions in a way that would ground a kind of desert claim here. If I were sort of Clarence Darrow defending her, like in a trial in The Good Place, I would have a pretty good argument, I think, for why she's not responsible. That the universe had been set up from before she was even born, such that she was determined to rob the liquor store. And likewise, Marina was determined to, give to the charity. But if both of them are determined in a way that is beyond their control, I would argue that neither deserves, in this just desert sense, to be praised or blamed, punished or rewarded in any fundamental sense.
Mhm.
Now, in the real world, there might be forward-looking reasons to engage in moral protests, to condemn their actions, and I don't deny that. I just said that that's not the kind of desert that I think is of central philosophical and practical importance.
Mhm. Yeah, so I have a few thoughts.
Yeah.
So I guess the piece about it is that shouldn't there's two frames here, right? Which is there's there's free will and or determinism at the individual level, and then how that scales up with how we cohabitate with 8 billion, human primates, right? Right. And if, as I would agree with you, I'm also on the free will skeptic side of things. If we don't, I don't know the next sentence I'm going to say,
Yeah.
right? I don't know, that I was going to, pick this up. I had no idea. I did not predetermine this. I'm moving based on whatever other things are happening internally. And if that's true, which I think it is for all people, shouldn't we, again, it is sort of a forward looking thing, but it's also not just forward, but kind of present at the same time with how people are operating based on within the world together as a society. Is shouldn't we, shoulds are a terrible word, but or should we or don't we operate under this notion of the illusion of free will, right?
Yeah. Okay. So again, though, I think it matters what we're calling it. So, like, I
Hmm.
don't deny agents have the ability to act on reasons.
Hmm.
And I don't deny that there's a difference between someone suffering from psychopathy
Hmm.
or um,
Schizophrenia or
Alzheimer's or
Mhm.
schizophrenia, that has less degree of autonomy or control or disapproves of their own actions or something.
Mhm.
Um, I think those distinctions all matter. I don't think, however, that they matter in terms of settling this question about basic desert for me. I
Mhm.
think that if those inner states themselves are the result of factors beyond their control, then agents are going to lack this kind of basic sense.
Mm.
Now, I want to kind of capture your intuition, though, and say I'm okay with calling these other things, right? Let's instead of calling it free will, let's call it degrees of control or degrees of autonomy.
Mhm.
And I'm okay with that. I'm also okay with preserving certain types of moral practices. Again, I don't deny, for example, a free will skeptic doesn't have to deny that what Hitler did was wrong.
Mhm.
We still can preserve axiological judgments of right and wrong and good and bad. Those don't hang on desert, I would argue, in any way. So that those kind of axiological judgments remain in place. I also think we could ground um, sort of forward-looking moral practices. Like I could engage you in a kind of moral conversation or an exchange if you wrong me and say, well, why did you act in that particular way? And I could get you to sort of reflect upon a flaw in your own character, selfishness or jealousy or hatred. Um, and I could point out the consequences of that trait, and we could agree or work together so that you in the future work to rectify this flaw in your own character. And the forward looking justification for this sort of moral conversation, this moral exchange, would not be basic desert, but would be in a forward looking sense grounded in future protection, future reconciliation, and future moral formation. I.e., as a member of society, I have a stake in your moral formation, or as a parent or a friend or a colleague, I have an interest in your moral development. Um, in terms of living, as you say, within a society, I also have an interest in safety. So we have a reason to engage fellow citizens in this kind of moral exchange. And if you're a friend or in some kind of interpersonal context, I also have maybe some stake in reconciling the wrongs that you've done, and so that we can move on. In that sense, I think that those kinds of practices are free for free will skeptics to adopt.
Mm.
Because for me, those are not grounded in backward-looking desert; they're grounded in forward-looking desideratum, like protection, reconciliation, moral formation. in that sense, I think Dennett and I's view are very close.
I was going to say, how is this different from the compatibilist view?
Well,
Right?
because I think so. Here's a couple of things. One, I don't think Dennett is a traditional compatibilist, and that's sort of what I argue in the book. Because I think traditional compatibilists are setting out to preserve basic desert, where Dan isn't. And so Dan, again, would disagree with all of this. Dennett would say he's not a skeptic,
Right.
never wanted to be a skeptic, denies his membership in the skeptic society. But Dennett wants to preserve the notion of desert. And what I would argue against his particular position, I think, is that what he means by desert is not. He should not try to retain this concept of desert, given that he's a consequentialist, given that he's a forward-looking theorist, because the notion of desert is too connected, too entrenched, and wrapped up with our notions of retribution. And with the kind of desert, I think, that comes out in the Kant case, the desert, desert island case, and in the Mayan Marina case. I think that what most people have in mind with desert is something like this purely backward-looking, intrinsic notion that individuals, you commit some kind of wrongful act, paradigmatically, or maybe a criminal act, you morally deserve to suffer, and that somehow that is intrinsically good, not because it's going to benefit others, not because it's going to, deter others, but simply because you deserve it. And I think that notion is just too loaded a concept to want to preserve free of retributivism. Now, he denies he's a retributivist in the book, and we go back and forth because I think in the end, Dennett has a mixed theory. He wants to preserve certain backward-looking features and certain forward-looking features, but I sort of push him, quite a lot in the book about what that amounts to as a view, and whether he is sort of committed to some retributive aspects. And he wants to deny it, but then I don't understand what he's essentially seeking to preserve.
This reminds me of the a few conversations he's had with Sam Harris. It's very similar, where he kind of gets tied up in all. He's got a little bit of here and a little bit of here and a little bit of here, and it is kind of a hybrid of sorts, I think. I
think it's a legitimate view. I just think it's a kind of unique view. I think he's a revisionist, which means that his notion of free will is not the folk psychological or common sense notion of free will. He wants to revise it and remove all of the trappings he thinks that have been, attached to this notion over time, especially through the kind of Judeo-Christian debates about free will and sin and redemption. He wants to remove all of that. He also, he's essentially giving you a forward-looking justification for backward-looking blame, which is a very hard and kind of unique view. It's a tricky view, and I just think it's a sophisticated view. It's one that does need to be taken seriously, but it does open itself up for easy misunderstanding. So if anything, I think the book is really useful in getting a better and clearer sense of what Dennett's view actually is, and maybe also what my view is. I think we both clarify misconceptions that people have about our views. So I think there's a benefit in that. Of course, I never persuade him that his view is, that he should, abandon the notion of free will. But my concern is that by holding on to the concept of free will, you're ultimately preserving certain notions that I don't think even Dan wants to preserve.
Such as?
And that's because, I think you had on as a guest in the past, Corey Clark, and she's done some work on this idea that, and this is empirical work that seems to show that what is really driving intuitions about free will is the desire to punish.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that people want to punish individuals, and so they try to seek justification for this intuition, this retributive impulse. And then they attribute free will to the person in the degree to which they want to punish them. So the more they want to punish them, the more free will they attribute to them, the more control. And what it's exactly putting the cart before the horse. What most compatibilists would think is the right way to proceed is first you determine whether an individual meets the conditions necessary for their account of free will. And you go through and you have to look at various aspects of, depending on what compatibilist account you're looking at, whether the agent had the kind of right ability to be responsive to reasons, were they moderately reasons responsive, or do they have some kind of hierarchical approval, that is, they approve of their own will to act in a certain kind of way, or they were free of coercion, or they had certain kinds of mental um, um, conditions that were in place, of voluntariness and freedom from constraint and things like that. And then you say, okay, now that we've determined that you've met these kind of conditions, then we assess responsibility based on how blameworthy or praiseworthy you are. That is an idealized version of what happens. In fact, what actually seems to be happening, and I think Nietzsche was the first one to actually say this, and now the empirical literature is actually finding it's true, is it's the exact opposite. Is that you have some kind of primitive, maybe even evolutionarily, developed, but some kind of primitive strike back emotion. You just, like you said before, like, ugh, you just did something wrong, and I want to punish you for it or blame you for it. And then you rationalize and engineer the degrees of control we want agents to have to satisfy to maintain our desire to punish them. And what we find is that, empirically speaking, people will adjust how much control we think is required for free will based on how much we want to punish them. They'll attribute more free will to agents that they want to punish more strongly, and less free will to those they want to punish less. We also find that people have asymmetric biases. So when I do something wrong and you do something wrong, we apply different standards.
Absolutely.
So when I do something wrong, we generally look for excusing conditions. We turn to situational features. Well, everyone would have done the same thing in that situation. I'm not really blameworthy because I was sort of determined by the situation and the circumstance. Whereas if you do something wrong in the same case, I apply a different standard and think you are blameworthy. And on praiseworthy acts, I'm less likely to praise you, because I'll say the exact opposite. I'll say when you do something praiseworthy, I'll say, well, everyone would have done the same thing, and that was really, situationally determined. You don't really deserve. And when I do praise, it was like I was a champion of, lifting myself up from the bootstraps. I was some self-caused agent, and I deserve all the praise in the world. All of these show biases in terms of what really is happening is when you preserve the notion of free will, you're keeping alive the notion of just desserts. And I find the notion of just desserts to be a pernicious notion, one that actually does more harm than good, and is kind of counterproductive, both in our interpersonal relationships, but also in terms of public policy when you get into like legal punishment and retribution and the criminal justice system.
So that's I want to turn to that piece, because that's I feel the pull in my mind of going there. But I have a few things. So let me give an example just to kind of close it up on this basic fundamental point. So if I go to the local 7-Eleven, right, or whatever, like the small mart, the grocery store, whatever, and I'm standing in the aisle, and I see a Butterfinger. Right. That's my favorite candy bar. And I say, I can either take this and pay for it, or I can take this and put it in my pocket and steal it. I have a choice to do one or the other. Or there could be I could take it and throw it on the ground and stomp on it, or whatever. I could throw it in. There's a bunch of choices, but let's just stick with the two. I could take it, pay for it, or I could take it and steal it. No one's going to maybe find out. I might know internally. I mean, I obviously will, but in that scenario, and you could scale this all the way up, right? Someone, is beating the shit out of somebody, and it's like, if I hit them a couple more times, I'll probably kill them. I have a choice to do that, or I could not, etc. And what you're saying is that that's already determined. What's going to happen is already going to happen.
Well, okay, let me just jump in and say, yeah, quickly, is that, and I may have given the wrong impression earlier about this. I'm neutral as to the truth of determinism, sort of officially.
Okay.
So I'm what's called a hard incompatibilist.
Okay.
I argue that whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, fundamentally, maybe at some micro level, we still lack free will. Because if determinism is true, it, I argue, is incompatible with free will for a number of reasons we haven't really got into. But basically, it's because agents aren't the appropriate source of their actions in the way that would, ground basic desert. If indeterminism is true, and your choice of whether to pocket the what candy was it again?
The Butterfinger, yeah.
Butterfingers, or pay for it was the result of some quantum flipping of a coin, in your brain that percolated up to the level of neural networks and then ultimately settled which action you perform. I would say that you're no more in control of that quantum event than you would be of a determined event. So that wouldn't help preserve free will either. And then thirdly, an issue kind of separate from all of these considerations, I think luck undermines free will.
I was going to ask you about luck.
Let's just even focus on luck, because I think determinism is one thing, but in this case, right, there's a number of factors you could focus on. So there's what's called constitutive luck, luck in the way that shapes you into the person you are, with the kind of moral psychology that you have, the kind of moral properties and characteristics you have as an individual. So that is constitutive luck. Luck in the lottery of life, luck in who your parents were, what society you were raised in, what kinds of moral norms did you get exposed to, and how they shaped you, etc. The luck of whether you had an encouraging parent or an abusive home, or the luck of whether or not you had a teacher that took you under their wing, or you lacked all support educationally. And then there's present luck around the time of action. Now, that could be a quantum kind of luck, but it could also be the luck of what shelf the Butterfingers were on, right? The luck of the color of the wall of the music that was playing in the supermarket. The luck of what kinds of reasons came to you in that particular moment for why you should either steal it or not steal it. The luck of which of those reasons became most salient and weighed most heavily on your deliberation. And you don't control any of those factors of luck.
That's right.
Luck is, again, outside your control. And what I would argue, whether you pocket the Butterfingers or pay for it, is a byproduct of a combination of both that constitutive luck and that present luck, or both, a factor of both, most likely. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to the powers of both constituent. So just take present luck. Like, we know that when when classical music is playing in a liquor store, people are willing to pay up to 10% more on a bottle of wine than if top 40. And they would deny that the music has any effect on their choice. And they would argue that it was all, they were the champion of their own choice of which bottle to pay for. But that music puts them in this unconscious mode of sophistication where they think it's more sophisticated to pay more, and so they'd be willing to pay more.
Right.
We know that people, marketers know that what level you place the candy on, the eye level or what shelf, will dictate your choices, your consumer choices are influenced.
If I got to reach down to get it, I'm not going to buy that one. But if it's right there at eye level, that's the one I'm pulling.
And there's no mystery why the candy is at the checkout aisle, because impulse buying is, if you ever had a kid and tried to get through the supermarket at the checkout and all the candy's there, it's because those are kind of purchases that people will just pick up right away, but wouldn't go out of the way to get, right? And so I would say, let's say you stole the candy bar. I can't psychoanalyze you, but right, the argument would be like, well, what were the factors that drove you to steal it, and how did you develop that type of character that reasoned in that particular way in that particular moment? And either factors of determinism, of upbringing, of past influences will play a role, or factors of luck, present and constitutive luck. And either way, I would say, whether determinism is true or indeterminism, or whether it's luck, the skeptical position I hold is that who we are and how we think and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, whether determinism, indeterminism, or luck. And because of that, we're never morally responsible in this basic dessert sense.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great way of putting it, and I would agree.
Let me just go, like, just to play sort of a further, I'm not a psychologist, but I'll play one today on this podcast.
Go. Good.
Why Butterfingers? Why is that your favorite? Right. So I use this in my class when I'm dealing with sort of intro level, stuff with my students. I'm just introducing them.
Yeah.
I'll say, like, imagine a case where, you go into the convenience shop. You're getting gasoline. You go inside to the store. It's a shitty store, so they only have like pretzels and sweet tarts, right?
Right.
And it's a choice, right? So which do you choose? And the student will say, "I choose the pretzels," and I'll say, "Well, why you chose the pretzels?" "I don't really like sweet tarts," and I go, "Okay, well, that's as interesting. Like, why don't you like the sweet tarts?" And eventually, things you keep on going with this, and eventually it bottoms out in something like, "I don't know. I just like certain things and dislike other things." Now think about that. Do you control that liking or disliking? Do you control the preference?
No, of course not.
If you could, I say just flip a switch and choose to like sweet tart things. Life would be much easier. I do this with my wife quite often. She doesn't like mushrooms. I say, just like mushrooms. And that just pisses her off further because she can't just flip a switch and like mushrooms, right?
Yeah, I'm with her. I don't like mushrooms either.
Okay, right. So if you could control that like or dislike, it'd be much easier to just like things in life. Our marriage would be better. We could share, pizza with mushrooms. But she can't. Now, since she has this kind of habitual liking and disliking, she's going to choose the thing on the menu without the mushrooms. And the guy is going to choose the pretzels if he prefers savory things over sweet tart things. But if you don't ultimately control the psychological factor that determines what you're choosing in that case, then you don't ultimately control the choice, I would argue.
Yeah.
And so why do we have certain likes and dislikes is sort of your whole life story.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think the problem for people is that it is a psychological thing. People don't like hearing that they don't have choice.
Well, I would say there's a choice. It's just not a free choice. That is, there's a difference between an eye twitch and choosing to buy pretzels.
But the free choice, the people don't like that notion. It feels like you're a prisoner in your own body, I would say, is how most people would see that. And so, which goes to these other things of, well, how do we get kind of these moral emotions? Would that somewhere fit on your continuum of degrees of control or degrees of freedom kind of thing? Or how do you understand guilt,
you're
shame?
raising the right kind of point. It's kind of like an existential point. I think that so people fear the implications of the skeptical perspective, that it's going to lead to nihilism or despair or undermine meaning in life, or we just have to let criminals run free. Right. And what I've been trying to do in my work is systematically go through and sort of make the world safe for free will skepticism by looking at each of these different domains and trying to say we could preserve most of what we care about. So I call myself an optimistic skeptic. I'm optimistic about the implications, the practical implications of skepticism. And as an optimistic skeptic, I maintain that we could preserve, meaning in life. We could preserve most of what we care about with regard to morality. We'd have to give up retributivism and certain severe forms of punishment, but I think that's a good thing anyway. So if you look at interpersonal, because that's the realm I think that matters to most people, interpersonal exchanges and interpersonal relations. If you know anything about like the Straussian literature, like Strawson was concerned that, if you adopt what he considered the skeptical perspective, you would have to treat people in certain objective kind of ways. You couldn't, experience, you couldn't justifiably, exhibit resentment and indignation and moral anger, but those are necessary, he says. I disagree on a couple fronts with that view. So one thing I would say is, you don't have to adopt a cold, calculating, objective stance, as he puts it, if we reject skepticism, if you reject free will. I do, though, think certain what he calls reactive attitudes would have to be rejected, or at least we would have to deny them any kind of justificatory power. So resentment and indignation and moral anger, I think, are inconsistent with my skepticism. But I would say that most other reactive attitudes remain in place because most other interpersonal emotions, most other interpersonal reactions we have are not predicated on the notion of basic deserve. And
Mm.
so can all just remain essentially as they are. The ones that do, I would argue that we would have to that there were that in most of those cases, those reactive attitudes were suboptimal in the first place, and that replacement attitudes could do just as good a job in our interpersonal relations. So take parenting.
Hmm.
Like my daughter engages in some kind of bad behavior. Instead of exhibiting resentment or moral anger, which, by the way, is often corrosive
Yes.
in interpersonal relationships,
Yes.
often actually is ends up producing negative outcomes. Like, I
Yes.
think when you're trying to train your daughter to be a good person and to acquire good morals, if you exhibit moral anger too often, or if you exhibit resentment, instead of resentment or moral anger, I would say disappointment
Hmm.
would
Yes.
be a legitimate emotion, and that could serve essentially the same function
Hmm.
as moral anger, and actually would probably be better pedagogically. Be better in terms of developing the kind
Yes.
of moral character that you want in her. So I actually think there are benefits to our personal relationships because they make us less blamey. They make us less willing to judge individuals in certain kinds of ways, but still can preserve the kinds of interpersonal exchanges that are necessary to shape individuals morally, to seek reconciliation, and promote the kind of things we want to promote.
Yeah, I think the one that jumps out to me is guilt.
Yeah,
The motion of guilt. Whereas, I did something and I because guilt is historically is attributed to, well, I did a thing that's wrong and
yeah,
now I feel guilty about it, and it usually leads to corrective action,
yeah.
right? So, okay, I feel bad. If there's, how do you?
But it could also be crippling.
Well, it could be
And
crippling as
it could be,
well.
like,
I
I
think
was
that
raised Roman. I was raised Catholic. I went to
yes,
Catholic school,
yes, 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 yes,
and
one hundred
there's a
percent.
deep sense of guilt where they sort of instill
Yes,
you with this crippling kind of guilt,
yes.
which I think is often quite harmful to
Yes. No,
individuals.
no,
Yeah,
100%. But I would say that we have developed over time, emotions like guilt or shame. So I think you're
yeah,
right, actually. The disappointment piece, I think, is more instructive because
yeah,
disappointment will promote a type of shame that can be very helpful and
productive.
instructive for the person and productive.
Yeah,
That would take too long to explain how there's the productive sides of shame,
yeah,
but there is intra and interpersonal benefits to having mild amounts of shame.
yeah,
Kind of again as a forward-looking kind of notion.
yeah,
Um, okay, so I do want to ask about the second book that's coming out, which we won't be
yeah,
able to cover everything, but I want to at least touch it. So when this conversation thus far has kind of been setting the, I think, groundwork for that. So you want to change how we understand retributive justice and these kind of punitive ways of the penal system and all the rest. What's your kind of your main thesis about how we correct some of these things?
yeah. So in the book, I develop. It's sort of broken into two halves. The first half of the book is laying out arguments against retributivism.
Hmm.
Um, and for those that don't know, retributive justifications of punishment maintain that punishment of wrongdoers is justified on the grounds that they justly deserve that punishment in the purely backward-looking sense we've been talking about. Um, and so I lay out six reasons why we should reject retributive justifications for punishment. I won't go through them. Some of them are probably clear from our earlier conversation. So, but only two of them actually depend upon my skepticism about free will. The rest are actually independent reasons, which you could accept even if you don't accept my views. But I won't focus on that. And then the second half of the book is my alternative. And my alternative is something I call the public health quarantine model. Um, and I view this as not only an alternative to retributivism, but I actually view it as an alternative to punishment. I see it as a non punitive approach. And my goal is to replace the reactive approach to criminal behavior with a preventive approach to criminal behavior.
Mhm.
So there's the public health part of the model, the public health framework part, And then there's this sort of quarantine analogy. So let me go with the quarantine analogy first.
Sure.
The idea would be something like this, like, well, if I got in a plane to come visit you and somehow I contracted Ebola on the way, and I get out of the plane and they test me and I'm test positive for Ebola. Well, I haven't done anything morally wrong, right, per se. I don't deserve retribution.
Right.
Just desert seems, ill-fitted in this case. We don't need to talk about free will. We don't need to talk about moral responsibility or basic desert. Nonetheless, I think everyone would agree that we're morally justified in quarantining this individual. And the justification for quarantine, and my model, is grounded in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to society. I.e., we're justified in quarantining you for public health reasons, i.e., to prevent a pandemic that could harm or kill other individuals. And the analogy would then be that we could ground a incapacitation account for seriously dangerous criminals. Like, we could justify incapacitating murderers and serial killers and serial rapists on an incapacitation account grounded in the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others that's analogous to the justification we have for quarantining people with communicable diseases. I.e., we could justify the serial killer on the grounds that of right of self-defense, where we don't need to appeal to free will. We don't need to say that the individual justly deserves punishment or needs to be punished. We're not appealing to just deserts or retribution. We're basically justifying incapacitation. And I see incapacitation in this situation as different than punishment. We don't punish the person with the communicable disease. Under no common sense definition are we punishing the Ebola patient. We are depriving their liberty. We are limiting their liberty.
Sure.
But we're not punishing them in any intuitive sense, because punishment typically involves condemnation. It typically involves intentionally harming an individual, imposing some intentional harm by the state. We're not doing any of those things. But the argument is that if you adopt this model, a number of really important reforms follow. So, like, for one, I adopt the principle of least restriction that says you have to adopt the least restrictive measures possible that's consistent with protecting public health and safety. So, for example, we don't quarantine people for the common cold.
Right.
But if I sneezed on you and you got sick, I'm causing you some harm. But we accept a certain amount of harm in society's acceptable risk. And in fact, society is juggling this right now with the current pandemic, right?
Yes.
There's going to be a certain amount of risk of reopening schools and reopening, restaurants. And we have to judge the right, level of risk to reward. But the idea is that a certain amount of risks are going to be built into the structure of society and respecting liberty, right? And I want to respect liberty as much as possible. So I want to argue that you have to adopt the least restrictive measures possible. And so, we restrict quarantine to very rare, very precise, very consigned special cases where the level of harm is really high, like global pandemic high, So for me, that means that many of the things we currently incarcerate people for, we have to reevaluate. And on my model, and I go through in the book looking at lots and lots of statistical stuff, that in most current cases, we have a mass incarceration crisis in the United States.
Yeah.
And for many of the reasons we incarcerate people for, I would argue that there are alternative methods that are preferable. So over 50% of people in U.S. prisons are suffering from a mental illness. Yeah. They may be better served with mental health services. Yes. Vast majority of people in prison are suffering from an underlying addiction problem. And that's why they're in prison. And so drug treatment options are better suited for those kinds of low-level crime. My view is that decriminalization should be a big part of the conversation. And so many of the things that are currently illegal, like personal possession of marijuana, we can decriminalize because they don't pose a significant risk to public safety.
Right. Yeah.
We have an aging out problem in prison where after a certain peak point of age, people's rates of recidivism almost drop down to zero. Like a 65 or 70-year-old imprisoned person who are retributivists could say they still deserve to be in prison because of this act they did. Well, statistically, the chances of them engaging in repeat crime, recidivism, goes down to almost zero statistically. That we lack any continued justification for holding those individuals. So imagine I cure you of Ebola. Once you're no longer a threat to public safety, I lose any justification for limiting your liberty. And so on my model, the purpose of the criminal justice system should shift from a punitive approach to rehabilitation and reintegration. So just like the public health approach is trying to rehabilitate, i.e. treat individuals and then reintegrate them after they're no longer a threat, my argument is we should do the same. And I also go through in the book what that means for like the physical design of prisons or the physical design of the institutions of incapacitation. Our current institutions are designed for punitive purposes. If we're going to adopt this non-punitive public health approach, we have to look at how these institutions are designed and what they're designed for. And I go through looking at even environmental design and some innovative designs that have come up in Northern European countries like Norway and Denmark and Sweden. That are specifically designed for rehabilitation and reintegration. And lastly, I argue that if you adopt this quarantine sort of approach, we cannot justify treating individuals cruelly. So I argue that the only right you lose, or should lose, that the sentencing court can remove is liberty. They can restrict your liberty in various ways grounded in this right of self-defense. But I argue you should retain all your other basic rights. I don't think we should strip people of voting rights or disenfranchise them or dehumanize them or strip them naked and house them in cages and deprive them of education. So just like the Ebola patient, you are justified in limiting their liberty by quarantining them, but you're not justified in any way philosophically dehumanizing them or stripping them of their other rights. And I would argue the same is true in the incapacitation account. That said, let me just throw this in for the moment. That said, I would say I owe you an account of what do I do for serial killers and child molesters. And so I just gave you an account. We could justify incapacitating them on this model. But I also want to shift the focus away from punishment to prevention and social justice. Because I think there's been a myopic obsession, a myopic focus on punishment. And that's natural. If you take a kind of approach that thinks crime is a byproduct of individual responsibility. Well, then if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you have this view, then everything is sort of dealt with through punitive methods. And even Dennett and I go back and forth on this in the book, where Dennett wants to preserve this kind of individual responsibility, whereas I see it as a kind of a stumbling block in the way of a more humane approach. So the public health approach is to use what has been long established, this kind of public health framework that is adopted in the public health arena to deal with public health. So when you look at things like various poor health outcomes, high morbidity, type 2 diabetes, low infant mortality, et cetera, a lot of these are driven by what I call the social determinants of health. Poverty, low socioeconomic status, unstable housing, homelessness, diet, nutrition, environmental health, education, housing, all of these things are part of what I call the social determinants of health. And what I've done in the book is through analyzing thousands of studies, argued that the social determinants for criminal behavior are essentially analogous to the social determinants of health. That what drives criminal behavior is essentially things like poverty and low socioeconomic status and exposure to violence and mental illness and access to healthcare and education and environmental health and nutrition. And so if you look at just things like, there's a case where a study was done on women in Rikers Island And they found that somewhere between 88 to 90% of the women who were imprisoned in Rikers Island had been victims of violence in the past, either domestic violence, sexual assault, childhood abuse, rape.
Yeah.
And so you know that there's a strong causal connection between being the victim of violence and then themselves committing criminal acts.
Mm-hmm.
Either the women often are convicted of crimes against their abusers, or sometimes this goes hand in hand with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a partnership where they have co-addiction and domestic violence, and they end up stealing or petty crime at the behest of their abuser. And so you know that there are these social determinants of incarceration. The proper thing to do is not to blame the people on the tail end, but to prevent the circumstances in the first place.
Mm.
And then the social justice component comes in because often these social determinants of health and criminal behavior are a byproduct of injustices, social injustice.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at like India,
mm-hmm.
and you look at women health issues, and you look at infant mortality rates, these are poor health outcomes. To improve the health outcomes, you have to address the underlying cause.
Sure.
But what you find is often the underlying cause is a social
mm-hmm.
feature of society. So for one, women don't have reproductive control over their bodies. And they ultimately are driven to have more children at the behest of their husbands or their mother-in-laws. And this leads to deaths in childbirth and low infant mortality and poor health outcomes. Literacy is very low among women. They find that increasing literacy will increase health outcomes for women. So to address the poor health outcomes, you have to address the underlying social injustice.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've argued is that you can't properly deal with criminal justice reform without simultaneously addressing social justice. Mm-hmm. And so I want to adopt a framework, a public health framework, that's aimed at essentially treating the underlying social causes for criminal behavior. And that involves dealing with things like sexism and racism and social and economic inequality and educational inequity and all of the sort of social features that drive criminal behavior. And so I think that if you keep the free will stuff at the forefront of your mind and you keep things focused on giving wrongdoers their just desserts, then your approach is going to be punitive. And it's going to be a barrier in the way of adopting what I consider a much more holistic, much more humane, much more practically effective set of policies.
Yeah, it's a very compelling argument. It's a very compelling argument. I can hear all the pieces of it. I guess the only pushback I would have on that is it would determine on how you view human nature.
Yeah.
If you think human nature is fundamentally flawed, this kind of, again, Judeo-Christian original sin kind of thing, or even if you don't have that, right? Even if you just look at the components of who we are as an evolutionary species, like, you don't have to put any moral attribution on it. You can just say, our genes want to get to the next generation. And so we're doing everything we can. And sometimes that is quote unquote harmful. And sometimes it's not, right? There's obviously good evidence, even if you look at some of the loose ends of kin selection, all these things, that we also want to preserve other things for our species as well. So, there's a kind of a mixed bag of sorts, but, there is, as you were talking, I thought of two things real quick is I totally agree with you on the kind of quarantine aspect. My question would be, and maybe you get into it in the book, which is, so what are, for those folks, aside from risk management and mitigating that, what is the kind of treatment that they receive when they're in quarantine, right? So, for example, if you think of, this is not a popular opinion, but in my field, I do clinical psych, and I've worked in inpatient psychiatric hospitals.
Oh, yeah.
And I firmly believe that many more people should be in institutions that are very sick. They're very, very sick, very, very sick. And that was a change in the 60s and 70s from deinstitutionalization.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is that we have a tremendous issue with homelessness, especially in many urban cities. And 80 to 90% of those folks are just mentally ill. They have no way. There's no, kind of to your point, there's no systemic or structural things in place to really help for those people to get treatment they need. And it's this kind of patchwork thing just because they don't want high numbers of people being housed in, institutions. And granted, for a long time, the way the care at institutions was distributed was grotesque. But I think in principle, I think your argument is right for folks that are, pedophiles, sociopaths, severe chronic mental illness. Those folks should be in some type of quarantine. But while they are there, they are having that there's a preservation of some quality of life as well.
Yeah.
As opposed to, again, also what happens is there is either a homelessness problem and or many of the folks that are in penitentiaries and or just jails, they also have a comorbidity with some type of mental illness as well. So you'll see so many people. It's like, well, social workers or psychologists or other folks will go to jails to do services because that's where their clients are. And so I agree with you on that completely, 100%. My concern would be, how do we make sure and we put in a new way of structuring those types of facilities where there's still quality of life for those specific individuals. And then
So I write a lot about that in the book. Of course, these are difficult issues, and so I want to leave everything sort of open to best practices and revision. And so I make about 13 really specific policy proposals in the book about some of these things. And I really spell out how the public health framework could be implemented successfully. And I also have a section where I address certain things about rehabilitation, but that is one of the harder components of the theory. What I would say is a bunch of what you said is actually really true and accurate, which is the abuses in the mental health institutions in the past was part of the cause for why they closed them. But that was supposed to be step one of a two-step process. They were supposed to close those institutions and then reinvest that money in terms of prevention and other sort of mental health services. And what they did, like we often do in politics, is they did step one, but they never did step two. And because of that, prisons have become essentially de facto mental health institutions, which is not what they're suited for. And so what I would say, and this brings us back to the earlier discussion, what kinds of rehabilitation works will often depend on what kinds of faculties and abilities and degrees of autonomy and reasons responsiveness agents have. So I think all the classical compatibilist distinctions matter, but now you can see how they matter in my theory differently. They don't matter for assessing desert or blameworthiness. They matter for forward-looking reasons. So like we're going to deal with a reasons responsive agent in terms of what therapies and what kinds of treatments would work differently than we're going to deal with someone suffering from psychopathy or schizophrenia. And so talk therapies or various types of interventions or psychological counseling may work better with reasons responsive agents than they would with agents suffering from deeper mental illnesses. And so those agents just may not be receptive to reasons in the kind of ways that would, help them or make them safer for release and things like that. So the different types of treatment is going to be adjusted to the differences in what kinds of abilities agents have. And so we do have to we do care a lot about what kind of faculties individuals have. We also care a lot about traditional things like mens rea, guilty mind. So imagine two different women. One woman, let's say, intentionally wants to kill her child and premeditatively plans this. And she decides the best way to do it is to make it look like an accident. So she brings her infant to work with her in the car and accidentally leaves the child in the car. Well, not accident, purposely leaves the child in the car, but wants it to look like an accident. And then woman B, let's say, ate some bad Chinese food last night, was up all night with food poisoning, was sick, got no sleep, but has to go to an important meeting. She drops her two oldest children off at school, but forgets the sleeping infant in the back car, gets to work, and sadly leaves the child in a hot car and the child dies. Each of them are causally responsible, right? So we could say that each of them are kind of connected causally to the death of the child. One of them had mens rea and premeditation. The other, let's say, accidentally was responsible for the child's death. What I would say is that, these are obviously two different cases, and it matters. But it matters not for assessing guilt. It matters for what kind of forward-looking threat these women are to society.
Mhm.
So the woman who was a one-off stomach flu, I don't think poses the kind of threat to society moving forward that would deem incapacitation, right? Where the other woman may. Let's assume she has other children. Those other children may be at harm's risk, right? Um, and so those things, those traditional categories in the criminal law matter, but they matter differently. They don't matter for assessing guilt in the traditional desert sense.
Mhm.
They matter for what types of forward-looking measures should we take. And then secondly, you'd have to then figure out what kinds of rehabilitation works most effectively with different types of criminals, with different types of abilities.
Mhm.
And this is the delicate line that I've delved into, but I still think needs further work, which is I want to maintain as much autonomy as possible in different kinds. So I'm not advocating any kind of clockwork orange behavioral, treatments. No, what I would say is if the agent's reason's responsive, we should favor therapies that respect the agency of individuals in a way that we involve the agent as much as possible in the rehabilitative process. And there are kinds of therapies that work really well here. And even just some sort of restorative justice model could be used, even if you have to remove certain components of it. But in general, bringing offenders and victims together to kind of work through reconciliation could often work, especially if the individual's receptive to the wrongfulness of their acts and acknowledging that, and work to modify those features moving forward.
Yeah.
I think in many, 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 many cases, simply providing them with work training, with educational opportunities, often is so. A lot of the underlying causes for a lot of petty crime is simply poverty, or that individuals lack the right opportunities, or they're in an environment where violence is a norm. That is, they're in an inner city where it's either join a gang or be prey. And so sometimes I've adopted what I call a holistic law model, where you look at the circumstances, not just of the crime, but of the person and the situation that they're in. And often hooking them up with other social services like job training, housing opportunities, and things that address the underlying circumstance, which in this case might just be poverty. That is an effective tool for reducing recidivism. In the more difficult cases, I would argue that the first option, if it's possible, is to restore reason's responsiveness. So one example might be if the individual is suffering from a drug treatment, suffering from a drug addiction. Maybe the drug addiction is preventing them from being receptive to reasons in terms of action because the addiction is getting in the way. It's overriding their reasons.
Yeah.
A lot of times addicts are acting in ways they don't approve of, right? Their reasons for action are telling them to do one thing, but the addiction's overriding their better sense.
Right.
Treating the underlying addiction, I'm not opposed to some forms of medication, right? So there's some types of, drugs that might help addicts to restore them to their reasons responsiveness, which then makes them more reasons responsive, not less. And then thirdly, you get into the really complicated cases. And those are the cases I struggle with because I think there are difficult ethical questions on both sides. So like take pedophilia as an example. Well, I would acknowledge that if the individual poses a forward-looking threat, like if you believe that if you release them, they're going to victimize other children, sadly, I think we have to continue to incapacitate them, but not in an inhumane way, right? Treating them with all the kinds of respect that persons deserve and all of that.
Right.
Nonetheless, I'm sort of on the fence with, and I'll just raise it because it's a very controversial thing.
Sure.
And I'm curious to know what your listeners think of it. And I've gone back and forth. Certain countries like Canada, for example, offer. So I've dealt with and I've held conferences and I've organized conferences with forensic psychologists, and one of them at one of these conferences talked about her work with pedophilic criminals in prison.
Yeah.
And Canada offers voluntary chemical castration as an option.
Yeah.
So they give the option. It's not forced castration.
Mm-hmm.
I would never condone forced castration, right? And it's not physical castration. It's chemical castration. Now, there are some scary side effects. There are some potential risks of chemical castration, but it is reversible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a benefit. If the person later wants to have a child or is no longer a threat to society, the effects of chemical castration could be reversed. But it depends on its effectiveness and it depends on what studies you look at. But let's just hypothetically say it's effective.
Yeah.
So the individual has the option of continued incapacitation, maybe indefinite incapacitation, or voluntarily choosing to undergo chemical castration, in which case we can release them. And let's say that the effectiveness of it is, very high, 95%, effective or something.
Mm-hmm.
Should that be an option on the table? I've never written about it, and I hate tying myself to this because I know there are complicated ethical questions with consent here.
Yes.
But I lean currently towards saying I would give the option to the individual and allow the individual to decide.
Yeah.
If it were an effective tool, I would say better to allow that individual to choose this option and gain their freedom. I'm not for incapacitating people who don't need to be incapacitated, and I want to limit incapacitation to the most extreme cases that can't be dealt with by any other means. And if we could protect children by giving this option, what the literature shows is that it eradicates the desires on the part of these people. So most of these people have a first order desire, and then a second order desire. And they don't approve of their first order desire. They have this desire to, have sex with this child, and they're attracted, but they don't want to be attracted.
Most of the time.
What you're doing is helping the agent get in line with their deeper self, their deeper values. You're not changing the agent. You're making them more the agent they want to be because you're allowing them to get their higher order and lower order desires in line with each other. And the way to do that is, to help eradicate the primitive behavioral impulses, which then allows them for their higher order values to say, this is the person I want to be. I don't want to have this lower order desire. What would you do? Would you give them the option?
So it's interesting. So when I worked inpatient for a year and a half, I ran groups with folks that had pedophilia in their history. So there's some research and literature that shows that there's a potential neurological component to this.
Yeah.
It's not well replicated. It's not a bunch of studies on it, but there's a handful. It's an option of, and that would have a different framework of understanding it, right? If you're talking about a neurological deficit, like other neurological deficits, that frames it very differently. It kind of goes back to the thing we we're talking about in the beginning. But let's just set that on the table for a minute. I think what's hard with pedophilia is that there is this sort of continuum of sorts.
Yeah.
And then there is also so many things that are also comorbid with it. So you were saying that most people at the first order and second order is correct. But there are some folks that have, there's a handful of folks that have cognitive limitations as well. Where they don't understand. They cognitively they don't have the cognitive faculties to understand that it is wrong, quote unquote, is wrong it is immoral, it's unhealthy to act upon those desires. And it's a hard boulder to push up that mountain because they're never because of their limited cognitive faculties, they're never able to understand that it is not right to do that. And so you're always giving some type of surrogacy or some replacement kind of to make up for their cognitive
Yeah.
limitations. And in those situations, it's complicated. It's
No,
very
I agree.
complicated.
Yeah, yeah. I think if it's the
For
case
other
that
folks, it might be different that have a higher cognitive capacity. And I think then in that situation, the first, second order, you take
yeah,
out the first order. There is a potential for that, and if it's high effectiveness, and that would be interesting to say. Well, if there's a volitional aspect where they say, "Look, I don't want to do this," and there are many folks that say
yeah,
that, "I
yeah,
don't want to do this. I know I what can I do? You know, what can I do?" I mean, I've seen men in tears about that. Like, I hate that I have this attraction or all these impulses. If only, you know, and I think in those scenarios, it could have some benefit. But I think there are other groups of folks where, because of the cognitive limitations, would be much difficult, and that would be
yeah.
even more difficult because of then it would say, well, if they don't understand, you know, they might not want to do this volitionally, so then we do it against their
Yeah, no,
will.
I would, yeah, never advocate that.
That's complicated.
To go back to, yeah, the psychopathy is one of the hardest categories to deal with because therapeutic options are sort of limited and
Yeah.
very ineffective so far in terms. I mean, I've seen some pilot programs that have shown that are extremely intensive, but have had some effectiveness. But part of what is problematic there is that there's a kind of epistemic issue where they don't quite fully understand the wrongfulness of the act, and so
Hmm.
um, those people might pose a different kind of forward-looking threat because without that kind of epistemic awareness,
Hmm.
it's very hard to imagine that they're that they're going to be able to that we would have any good justification for thinking they're not going to engage in some future violent act again. And so violent psychopathy is one of the hardest to treat. And sadly, I think in many cases, incapacitation or continued incapacitation is sort of the only remaining option. But I would just say on all of these, I'm open to empirical work on what works effectively. I'm concerned with obviously ethical considerations of consent. So I think it's very difficult. But for the vast majority of people,
Yeah.
I would say that a lot of it has to do with social factors, and
Yes.
that the crimes are the byproduct of really circumstance more than individuals, i.e., um, we've reinstated debtors jail essentially now because the fining system and the system of fines that we've imposed and court fees essentially have led to the imprisonment a number of people that are simply in prison because they can't pay certain amounts of money,
Hmm.
which seems to be fundamentally not an issue of justice and definitely not about desert. And so I think that for many, many low level nonviolent crimes, alternatives to incapacitation are available. I think for some, mental health services are better options. I think some types of therapies have proven effective for different types of criminal behavior. And then I think we're going to be left with this remnant of the really hard cases. But I
Yeah.
would say that those cases are hard for everybody.
I would
They're hard for whether you're a retributivist or not a retributivist.
100%.
They're hard for consequentialists. They're hard for people like me. But I would hope that that's a small class of cases.
I'll say I have three quick points. So about the psychopathy piece.
Yeah.
So we understand psychopathy now more as a continuum for sure.
Yeah.
And in fact, most individuals have some traits of psychopathy. In fact, I mean, I don't know if you know
Yeah,
this.
working. Yeah,
Many
functional
many
psychopathy.
high functioning individuals have they fall somewhere on the hair scale of psychopathy. You know,
A lot of
it's an
business
interesting way.
CEOs.
Yeah, yes, yeah, the big CEOs, people in government, like, you know, there's some traits. So it is a continuum kind of model, which I think is right, which is we're still trying to figure out how that how that works. About the so I don't know, it's a longer discussion, but I agree with you about the social structures for a majority of people. But look, take out the extremes for a minute, right? People that have cognitive limitations, people that have, you know, abuse and trauma, people that have, mental illness. Take all those out for a minute.
By the way, that's probably the vast majority of those who are incarcerated.
Right? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. But there are, I think it is a my pushback on that is that it is a little bit of a broad net, and I don't think you're entirely saying that, but uh, I hate using myself as an example because it sounds so like narcissistic. But, I grew up in a really tough area when I was a kid. I mean, really tough. And, we were lower middle class. And I mean, a really, really, really hard area, right? There was lots and lots of criminal activity, and we were just, trying to make ends meet. And it is most certain that many people in, my peers did turn out in many of these ways, right? They wound up in the criminal system. But there are examples like myself where that I don't have a criminal record. I'm fairly well educated, and I do well for myself, and I was able to come out of that. And you hear a lot of cases like that, and it is hard to say, well, how. I think the vast majority of cases.
I would again, this is where I kind of go to luck quite often. I mean, I would just say that, it's hard to point. I don't know your story or your biography, but in many of these cases, either small or large factors of luck are ultimately determining what happened and how the outcomes diverge.
Absolutely.
Like I think there's a book by what's his name? He's the political pundit, Wes Moore, called The Two Wes Moores. And it's similar to what you're saying, where there was another Wes Moore, literally. This is like a real book, a non-fictional book based on his childhood, where there was another guy in his town called Wes Moore, and his name was Wes Moore. And he ended up going into the military and has this illustrious career on MSNBC and all this. And the other guy went in and out of prison, and he tries to trace what happened in the case of the two Wes Moores. But what you often find is that just small little different factors of luck, like
Absolutely.
Maybe as a younger child, you engaged in some of the same practices that your friends did, but you didn't get caught. And that was a factor of luck, where simply getting caught at age 14 or 15 could put someone in a juvenile system. That then ultimately that one thing that both of you did the same act, but had two different outcomes, which, was a byproduct of luck. And that outcome ultimately put one person on one track and another on another. You might have had an encouraging teacher or a different encouragement from your parents than the following, individual. There are all these real small kind of, and social, and I even like what I call, present luck, the luck of like what happens in the particular moment is often, can make a difference in terms of the two different outcomes. And then there's the constitutive luck. Like maybe you just worked hard, and your dedication and your fortuitousness and your stick-to-itiveness and all of those perseverance features is a part of your character. But then the question is, you didn't make that character.
No.
That character is a byproduct of factors of luck, right? And so either you were born with certain psychological predispositions or you acquired them. And so I often hear people say that, like, oh, I was raised in the same ghetto and I didn't turn out like that, and somehow I deserve the praise for that. But I think quite often it's not. When you really look at the numbers, you really look at the statistical factors, so much of it is things that you could attribute. So I'll give you one really weird example.
Sure.
I mentioned nutrition, and that's an easy one when you think about the social determinants of health. Easy to see how nutrition affects, health. And we know how poverty affects nutrition and healthy diets and all of that. But there's also findings that show nutrition is linked to criminal behavior. And so there was this study done in Mauritius, this island,
African
poor
island.
island. What's it?
It's off
Adrian
Africa?
Rain. Yeah, I think Adrian Rain did this study. Maybe it could have been other people involved in the study as well.
Okay.
Where he actually stumbled upon an earlier study that had been done and then took advantage of it by going back and reevaluating. And so what he found was about 20 years ago, there was this so-called enrichment program done in Mauritius, this poor island community. And some kids were put in a control group, and certain kids were put up in this enrichment program. And the enrichment group involved some like additional recreational activities and maybe some additional educational opportunities. But the main difference was they were given 3 helpings of fish a week, higher in omega-3s. And he decided to go back 20 years later to see what that difference might have resulted to in big social terms. And he found that the kids in the control group that didn't have the higher omega-3 diets had higher rates of expulsion from school, higher rates of detention, lower overall income, higher rates of incarceration. And so he decided to see if this can be replicated. And so he went into prison and got permission to do like a supplement study where he simply gave out omega-3 pills. And he, in prison, among violent populations, people who had been convicted of violent crimes. And he found that simply introducing additional omega-3s through supplements reduced violent incidences within the prison.
It's fascinating.
The rates of violence. And now, of course, like, just giving everyone omega-3 pills or something is not, or fish oil, or something, is not going to solve the curve. But what it does show is like even things like diets and nutritional, certain nutritional developments affect criminal behavior and rates of violence. And often, in almost all these cases, it affects it via the brain, right? Because the nutritional effects affect brain development, which affects moral development, which then affects moral behavior. And so this is true even in environmental health. So we know like the kids in Flint, Michigan were exposed to high levels of lead exposure. We know that that is going to lead to all these health consequences and cognitive disabilities. But studies have also shown that exposure to lead is also correlated with higher rates of incarceration and criminal behavior. And so we know we come from poorer communities that might have higher levels of lead exposure can affect things like incarceration rates in those communities. And all of that's a byproduct of luck, right? Where you were born in a building with lead paint or born into more stable housing where regulations protected you from lead exposure, whether you had, lived in a poor community where people made political decisions to just flip a switch and reroute the water supply through these lead-infested pipes, is results in different outcomes. Now, people can overcome the outcomes.
Yeah, that was my kind of point too. Is like definitely on my end. I think most of it personally is a lot of luck, but in all the three senses. And I do think what you're saying is right. Is if we're able to build better infrastructures where people's environment and their society, you're placing chances a little bit better for things to spill out, I guess, where there's less likely where you have all of these things, which I think is right. But there are instances where people do kind of like shoot out of it.
Let me go back to, maybe we'll end with this. I want to go back to the Dennett book. There's a part in the exchange where we're debating this question of luck, and Dennett's the king of like folksy analogies. He's really good at these kind of analogies. And he goes, all right, imagine a foot race, and we give someone a head start based on a factor of luck, like what month their birthday was in. You didn't choose that. You have no control over that, right? So let's say, okay, your birthday was July. We'll give you a head start. Now, he says, is this fundamentally unfair? Does this lead to like some fundamental injustice? So I understand the lottery of life is not fair and luck, has an impact. But so Dennett says, well, look, would this be fundamentally unfair? He says, well, it would if the race was a sprint. And you had such a head start. But life is more like a marathon, he says. And over the course of life, luck equals out. And I say bullshit to that. All the statistical data shows quite the opposite, that initial inequalities in life compound themselves over time. So I use the sports analogy in return, since he used the sports analogy. And I borrow this from Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. He found that this weird anomaly where he looked at hockey players who made it to the professional NHL, the National Hockey League. And he found this weird bell curve where there was a cluster of people at the top of the curve whose birthdays clustered in 2 months. And I just make it up. I think it's like January and December and January. Now, it was way beyond statistical chance. Like there was no way you could have this distribution of birthdays.
Some latitudinal gradient going on there.
Yeah. And, occasionally a July birthday would make it to the professional leagues, but like overwhelmingly, like 80% of them were like from January and December. And how could this be? And what he found was vast majority of these players come from Canada. They're born with a hockey stick in their hands. Right. And they're entered into the Pee Wee leagues. They start playing like ice hockey the minute, like as soon as they could walk, really, right? They're put in skates and they're put on the ice.
Right.
So at 4 or 5, they're put into these Pee Wee leagues. And the cutoff date for whether you were the oldest in the league or the youngest in the league was based on what month you were born in. Mm-hmm. And if you were born in one of these 2 months, you were the oldest. Mm-hmm. Now think about this. At age 4 or 5, having an 11-month developmental advantage over the kid next to you on the skates is a huge advantage. It's not innate skill. It's not ability. It's not how hard you work. You're just a year older, which means you're a year bigger. You have a year more hand-eye coordination. You're better on skates. You're better with the puck. So you do a little better.
Happens in schools too. Late birthdays or whatever.
Same thing. And the next level up, that player is put on a better team, given better coaching, plays better players. Maybe eventually he's sidetracked into an elite league where he gets better facilities and better equipment and better training and more competition. And as this snowballs, it ends up that this small matter of luck, right? You just happen to have a December birthday, makes it like 80% more likely that you're likely to make it to the professional leagues. Now, you're right. That hardworking July kid can make it, but he has to overcome a natural inequality of luck.
That's right.
And I would argue his ability to overcome that natural inequality of luck is itself a byproduct of luck. I.e., he might have a constitutive character where he just works a lot harder, puts in a lot more effort. Yeah. But that's because he's a certain kind of person, and that kind of person was developed by factors of luck.
Yes.
But it's a natural barrier that he's going to have to overcome of unfairness, but of natural unfairness. Now, once you know about these things, as you say, we could organize society to better overcome them. So like in schools, there's the same thing with the oldest and the youngest in class outperforming each other. And one suggestion is to have rolling start dates. Instead of having it be 12 years where one kid sitting at one desk is 11 months older than the kid next to them, maybe we start every 3 months where kids are more developmentally similar to each other and things like that. So, once you're aware of the inequalities that are born of these factors of luck, you could start to re-engineer things to overcome them. But yeah, it shows you how powerful luck could be.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. No, that's a really good example. We didn't get to intentions and values, but maybe that's another conversation. But listen, you've been more than generous with your time. I feel super grateful for the time you've spent. It was super awesome. It was everything I wanted it to be and more. So, and I hope I'm pretty sure listeners will quite enjoy it. So, tell us where we can buy your books and where we can find you and listen to you and hear you and get all the most up-to-date stuff from you.
Sure, yeah. You can find most of my written works and links to my books on my website, which is www.greggcaruso.com. So it's simple. Gregg, my name is spelled weird. So Greggcaruso. Also, you can follow me on Twitter and books are available pretty much where all books are sold. So online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, independent bookstores, obviously support independence. So wherever readily available.
Okay, no, that's great. And of course, I'll put all that in the notes. And Gregg, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting.
Thank you for having me, Xavier.
Of course.